Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Elective 3 Excellence in Legal Research session. My name is Professor Ashley Arrington, and today we are focused on advanced regulatory research. So let's think back to our LP research workshop during 1L. In our spring semester, we did a workshop focused on regulations. So let's think back to that and ask ourselves where regulations fall within our four-step research process. And what were the main takeaways from our research workshop on regulations? So if you'll recall, our first step in our four-step process is working through our preliminary analysis, right? Going through your who, what, when, where, why, who are the parties, what's the legal issue at play, what is the jurisdiction, etc. What do we know? What do we need to know to answer the question? So that's step one, right? Preliminary analysis. Then we move on to step two, where we're evaluating relevant secondary sources. That will hopefully point us to relevant primary sources. So step three would be relevant codified law. So we're thinking about not only statutes, but also regulations, constitutional law, perhaps local court rules. And we want to find that relevant codified law before we move on to step four, looking for relevant case law. We want to find that codified law on point before we look to the case law that helps to interpret that codified law. So, as we said, that step three, codified law, can encompass more than just statutory code. It also encompasses regulatory code, constitutional provisions, and again, as we said, local court rules, and our regulations would fall within that step three. So we're thinking back to that step three of our four-step process. What were the main takeaways from our research workshop on regulations? So again, if you'll recall some of those learning objectives, we talked about using an index, a table of contents, and our annotations within a statute to help us find relevant sections of the Code of Federal Regulations. We also used relevant annotations to a regulatory code section for analysis, right? So in doing that, we look to the statutory authority and the source note. So what are those things? You'll recall statutory authority is the statutory code that is providing the authority for our regulatory agency to execute that particular regulation, right? And so under source, we will see, for instance, 27 USC 492, right? And that would be the US code that's authorizing this particular regulation and specific regulatory code section. And then the source note, so you'll also recall that we talked about the federal or Texas register. So in the instance of a federal regulation, right, you'd go back to the federal register for the proposed rule and final rule. And so you'd find that information at the bottom of your regulatory code section on any of your databases that are housing these regulatory codes. So we'll look at that on our databases in just a moment. We're also going to be thinking about the relationship between statutes and regulations. And we've just touched on that already, right? We need statutory authority in order for regulatory authority to come about, right? We can't have applicable regulatory provisions in place unless we've been granted that statutory authority. And then you'll recall that we talked about the publication process for regulations during our LP research workshop on regulations. So let's recall what that looks like. So again, where are the rules and regulations published? So different places based on whether we're thinking about federal rules and regulations versus state-specific rules and regulations. So at the federal level, our proposed rules or regulations are published in the Federal Register. Then we move on to our final rules or regulations, also published in the Federal Register. And then ultimately, our permanent version, our codified version, is published in the Code of Federal Regulations. Similarly for Texas, right, we have our proposed rule or regulation published in the Texas Register. Then it is published again in the final rule. The final rule or regulation is published in the Texas Register. Now note, there may be changes, right, between the proposed rule and the final rule. So these two versions may look different. And then again, our last stage, we've got our codified rule or regulation that in Texas is published within the Texas Administrative Code. Why would we use the code and why would we use the register? So we're using the code if we want to look at the regulatory code as it stands, right? We want to see the rule or regulation as it's currently in place. We want to see those amendments if there have indeed been amendments made to the code. And you'll recall that the code is arranged by subject area. So what about using the register? We would look to the register, either the federal or Texas Register, if we needed to view previous versions of these rules or regulations. And we might also look to them to find guidance that is relative to that particular rule or regulation. So we could find proposed rules there, temporary rules, and then again that guidance would be agency commentary and notices of open meetings, right? Additional forms of information that may be useful that we would not find in the codified version of the Texas or Federal Register. The Texas and Federal Registers are chronological publications. They're published weekly, and we've got a couple of links here we can take a look at for both the state Texas Register and then the Federal Register as well. And then thirdly, we've got Westlaw or Lexis, and coverage of the Texas or Federal Register there can vary. So I'm starting here on the Texas Secretary of State page. So again, you'll find that link on the PowerPoint slide we were just looking at. So we're at our Texas Secretary of State page. If we scroll down, we can see a link to the current issue of the Texas Register rather. And then we can look to our previous issues. We've got both of these available in HTML or PDF versions. We can also search the Texas Register, and then we've got guidelines for searching as well. So that may be helpful to us as we familiarize ourselves with this particular source. So let's move into search the Texas Register. So you can see we're linked to this very modern website, right? So you can see it contains documents published in the Texas Register starting in February 2000. So if we had the information such as our agency, our title number, rule number, we could use those things to get to find relevant proposed or final rules, right? That's what we are finding within the Texas Register. We could also search preamble text or document text. I'm going to use air cargo just as an example. I click find here. And then we've got a number of rules that are specific to aircraft issues that are mentioning air cargo. You can see we've got our final rules as well as our proposed rules, right? And so we can take a look at one of these. And then we see in the register what that rule looks like. We've got our definition section up top. We've also got our preamble up top, which give us some background information on amendments relative to that rule. Moving to the Federal Register, again, we're looking to that link in our PowerPoint slide. And this, once again, is for those proposed or final rules, right, before the ultimate codification of the Code of Federal Regulations. So if you'll see here under Search Federal Register Documents, I've run a search for air cargo security requirements. So I'm going to enter that language. We can see that it will give us 26 total documents. So if we were to press search, that would take us to all of the relevant documents that may include notices, rules, the final rules, or proposed rules. We could also narrow by publication date. We could narrow by agency or topic or section. Let's go back. With that same search phrase, we can limit our search to final rules. So we click rule and you can see this number changes, right, to 9 documents. We could narrow into proposed rules. So of those 26, now we're looking at just 3 documents. We could look at the notices, 14 documents, right? Or the presidential documents. We don't have any presidential documents relative to this particular issue within Federal Register documentation. You can also scroll to more recent proposed rules, more recent presidential documents. There's a lot of helpful commentary on using this particular website. So we've got website features, document features, search tips and techniques. So all of these links are links that may be helpful for you as you familiarize yourself with the Federal Register. So the current issue of the Federal Register is going to be what has been published daily, right? This is our daily journal. So this is going to contain those daily regulatory documents, so those proposed rules that have not yet been evaluated or moved on to the final rule stage. Under public inspection, we'll find documentation of regulatory information that has not moved to the current issue. So these are things that are being inspected but have not yet been published in the Federal Register, right? With respect to Lexis and Westlaw, if you'll recall, we can enter a source if we know exactly where we're going, right? So if we know that we're moving into the Texas Register or the Federal Register, I'll use the Federal Register here. We can type that source name in and then it'll pop up as a source, right? So we know exactly where to find our Federal Register and those current rules, right? So these are the rules that have been published, whether proposed, final, notices, or presidential documents, right? All of this information contained in the Federal Register, organized by date. Same thing with Westlaw, right? We could type in our Federal Register. If we know we're going to our Texas Register to look for proposed or final rules, we can type that in. Again, we're looking for proposed and final or adopted regulations. So you're seeing that that pops up, as well as the Texas Administrative Register, which is the historical version of the Texas Register. But you can note it's not listed as Texas Register here. It's listed as proposed and adopted regulations, but we can click there in order to get to the relevant Texas Register information, and then you can search within this top search bar. You're searching directly within the Texas proposed and adopted regulations or the Texas Register, right? We've also got our tools and resources at right, so we can look through all of these rather than our most recent documents. We could set alerts for tracking Texas regulations, and then again we've got our link for historical proposed and adopted regulations from the Texas Administrative Register. This is just an example of what some of those pages look like in print. So on the left, we can see our Federal Register page, and we've got our relevant code section coming from the Code of Federal Regulations. We've got our authority note, right, where we see where in the U.S. Code section the authority for this regulation or this regulatory authority was provided. And then we can see under source where the proposed and final rule within the Federal Register was published before this, before moving on to the codified version, right? So, and then we have our definition section. At right, we've got an example of a Code of Federal Regulations page. So we're looking at C16 CFR Part 310, and this rule happens to be specific to the Federal Trade Commission. And this rule contains the final rule amendments, right? So those amendments made following the final rule that you found in the Federal Register. With respect to Texas, you'll find that same source note at bottom, right? So you'll find the Texas Statutory Code section that provides authority for that regulation. And then you can also view the citation to the final rule. So if you're looking in the Texas Administrative Code, at bottom you would find a citation to the Texas Register, right? And then you go there to look for the proposed or final rule before that codified version. And you can find transcripts related to Texas regulations. Not always, but sometimes they are available on the relevant agency's website. So that's another place that you can check. Again, may not be there, but that is one other option if you are looking for additional guidance and transcripts relative to a Texas regulation. So we looked at the Texas Register and the Federal Register on our free government websites as well as Westlaw and Lexis, right? So now what about that codified version? So looking to the Texas Administrative Code or the Code of Federal Regulations, right? That's that ultimate publication of the rule or regulation. They are arranged by agency and subject area, and they're published annually with quarterly updates based on the title. So where can you find them? We've got a couple of official sites that are freely available. We'll look at those in just a moment. And then we've also got our unofficial commercial sources that include Lexis or Westlaw that are updated within a couple of business days of the publication. And you can always look to the bottom for that currency information. So now we're following that link once again to the Texas Secretary of State webpage, and this takes us to the Texas Administrative Code. So our Texas Register and our Texas Admin Code are both available via the Texas Secretary of State's website, right? So we can view the Texas Administrative Code, again, very modern website, right? But we can browse by title. So that's one way that we could get to a relevant regulatory code section. We can also search the Administrative Code, and then once again, super modern website, right? But we could do the same thing that we did to search the Texas Register by entering the information that we have. If we had the rule number, we could also search by agency name, or we could do that same thing, right, where we searched air cargo, and then we could find the the regulatory code sections specific to aircrafts related to air cargo. So remember, we saw a number of these listed under the Texas Register. Some of those were proposed, right? But here is just a list of those regulatory code sections that were ultimately codified, right? So that's what we're seeing here. Per that second link, GovInfo, now we're looking at the Code of Federal Regulations here. So you can see that you can browse the Code of Federal Regulations and you can browse chronologically. So here we're looking at 2023. We can go back to previous years, right? So that's one way that we can browse the Code of Federal Regulations. You also see a link to the eCFR, or the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations, and it shows this is a regularly updated online version. So if we click there, that takes us to our eCFR. You can see it looks similar to our Federal Register page, and so you can search there as well. You could search, you could browse by title in the same way that we did on GovInfo, or we can search by reference, so you can use your citation, or you could use a search term, right? Fishing is the example here. And you may want to look to the Getting Started guide to understand how to better search the eCFR. There's lots of helpful guidance, navigating to relevant content, providing some context for what you're looking at, and then understanding changes that have occurred within the eCFR over the course of the years. So just as we did with our Texas-specific materials, we can do the same with our federal codified regulations, right? So here we're looking at a Code of Federal Regulation specific to telemarketing sales. And you can see at the bottom here, we've got our authority note, which points us to 15 USC 6101-6108, which again is the statute that's providing the authority for this regulation to be administered. And then our source note, so again, this is our ultimate codified version within the Code of Federal Regulations, but if we wanted to look to our proposed or final rule versions, we would go to the Federal Register, right, and specifically 75 Federal Register 48516. With respect to updating regulations, you can look to our currency information, right? Scroll to the bottom to look to see if it remains current and to see those revision dates, amendments if they're there. You can use your citator information if you are using Lexis or Westlaw. And then you can also check either the Texas Register or the Federal Register for recent changes. Remember, those are published daily. We just looked at this with our CFR example, right? If you want to trace those past regulations, you could look to the source note, right? That pointed us to the Federal Register. So we could go there to look at our proposed or final rules. We could go directly to that final rule in the Federal Register if we knew that citation already. We could also look to commentary on regulations.gov that might discuss some of the changes between the available document as it looked in the Federal Register versus the Code of Federal Regulations. With respect to administrative decisions, these can sometimes be difficult to find. In some instances, agencies will have a special reporter where they contain these decisions. So some examples include the employment practices decisions, Board of Immigration Appeals decisions, but not always the case, right? Available for some agencies, but not others. In addition to those special reporters where available, an agency website is a good place to start with respect to a no-cost option. So looking to that agency's website to see if they have housed administrative decisions there. And then there's also our commercial options, right? We've got Lexis, Westlaw, or Bloomberg. So let's look at those really quickly. So here we are on our main Westlaw Precision page, If we move into content types, we see our link to regulations. We also see our link to administrative decisions and guidance. And then we've got our federal guidance. You can see divided by agency. Note that obviously these do not include all of the federal regulatory agencies. We can also narrow by states. We can move into Texas administrative decisions. This is another place that we can look in addition to those free resources. With respect to Lexis, we're on our main page here again, and you can see we're on our main content tab here. We don't see a link for regulations, right? On Lexis, they're referring us to administrative codes. So that's the same thing, right? Our administrative codes are our regulatory codes, so we've got that there. We also have regulation text or tracking, and then our registers, right? So our proposed and final rule versions. You can narrow by federal administrative codes or regulations, state as well, and then you've got practice area as an option to narrow. And so that is one way to search via Lexis. We'll go back to this main page, and then below administrative codes, we see administrative materials. If we click there, we can narrow by state, right? So if we moved into Texas, that would take us to the Texas Register or the Texas administrative code. And then we could also narrow by self-regulatory organizations, right? We can see a lot more listed here than we saw on Westlaw. We could also narrow by practice area as well. So this would be a place to find additional relevant administrative materials. And just a few examples, right? We could get to a particular source and then search within that source using these document segments and fields, or we could search using a natural language or Boolean terms and connector search within that particular source. Finally, recall that you can use your citing references to get to administrative decisions and guidance. So here we're looking at a CFR section 211.1 on visas. We've gone to our, we can see our citing references tab up top. And once we've gone there, it highlights a link to other relevant regulations, right, as well as administrative decisions and guidance. Now I'm looking at this same Code of Federal Regulations section on Lexis, right? So I've just gone to the same code section. If I click on other citing sources, I get to other sources that have cited this particular code section, right? Then we could narrow by content. We've got regulations here, as we saw on Westlaw. We're not seeing any additional administrative guidance, but if there was additional administrative guidance, we would find that under content as well. So just another reminder that the information can vary, the availability of information can vary based on what database you're using. Let's move to an exercise and work through this together. We've got our hypothetical here. A potential client of our firm has missed 2 weeks of work because they were sick with the flu. She saw a nurse practitioner twice during her absence from work, and when she returned, her boss informed her she was terminated for missing too many days of work. So now a senior attorney wants to know if the flu can be considered a serious health condition under the FMLA, which is the federal, why am I forgetting what this means, what this stands for? Family Medical Leave Act, not federal, although it is a federal act. Okay, so let's look to Westlaw to try to find the answer to this question. Let's look specifically at our sub-questions. We've got, first, we want to find the Family and Medical Leave Act in Westlaw. So we've got our USC citation we can use here. And then we can use our annotations to find a relevant CFR section. So we'll need to note where we look to find that section. Secondly, we want to go to that section we've identified using the annotations and list that citation. And then finally, we want to check to verify whether there are any administrative decisions that cite the section we've identified, and confirm how we found those. So let's move into Westlaw to do that. We'll take our relevant code section here. In Westlaw, we know exactly where we're going, right? We've got our citation 29 USC 2611. So we're going to search with that citation, and that takes us to our chapter on family and medical leave, and then we've got our section 2611, which is our definition sections that apply to this subchapter. So again, right now we're in our U.S. code section, so we're looking at statutory code, right? We've got our reference to the U.S. Code Annotated, which is of course Westlaw's commercial version of the U.S. Code with their additional annotations. If we were citing to the actual code section, we would cite 29 USC 2611 because we're not citing that annotated version, right? So our question is asking us to use the annotations to find a relevant CFR section. So these tabs at top are what we are considering our annotations, right? These are all notes, additions that have been provided by our wonderful attorney editors at Westlaw. So if we look under context and analysis, we are able to find a reference to a code within the Code of Federal Regulations. And then that points us to 29 CFR section 825.100 and beyond, right? So that tells us the purpose of the Family and Medical Leave Act, but that's the only CFR section that we're pointed to. So we found that via context and analysis, right? Once we went to the relevant U.S. code section, and we've identified that CFR section, so that's our answer for number 2. Are there administrative decisions that cite this CFR section? So if we look under citing references, we see administrative decisions and guidance. So we have content that includes administrative decisions as well as the Federal Register documents, right? So the answer to that question 3 would be yes. There are administrative decisions, and we find them under citing references. Now, lastly, I want to go back to that U.S. Code section, right? Our definition section of the Family and Medical Leave Act. And remember, we used context and analysis to get to that code. We could also find additional relevant regulations, right, that are citing our code section here. This does not include, let's see, we're under regulations, we can use our filters, but if we look at jurisdiction here, we see that we've only got state regulations and not federal regulations, so we're finding something coming from the Arizona administrative code, California as well, but we are not seeing any federal code from the Code of Federal Regulations. So if that CFR section were to have cited the USC, we might find that here. Since we're not, we want to look to that context and analysis once again, right? We could also look to administrative decisions and guidance that have cited to this USC section, right? And again, under here, in the same way that we saw with our CFR section, we find administrative decisions and Federal Register documentation that's citing this statutory code section within citing references. So to review our 3 exercise questions, right? We had our U.S. Code section. That's where we found that statutory act in Westlaw. Then we looked to our annotations, which again were those tabs up top, right? That's that information, those notes that our wonderful attorney editors have put together to help us in our research. We used that context and analysis tab or annotation to find the relevant CFR section. And that section was 29 Code of Federal Regulations 825.100. And then from that section 825.100, we looked under citing references to find administrative decisions that cite this particular CFR section. So if there are questions about this particular regulation and how it's implemented, that's where we would find administrative decisions, where an administrative law judge would have looked to those issues and helped us to determine how that particular regulatory section was meant to be implemented and applied, right? So that's what we're looking at when we find administrative decisions that are relative to a regulatory section. If you have questions about any of these, please let me know. I'm happy to go over these questions with you. If you have other additional questions, or you have questions regarding the final assessment, please feel free to reach out to me. You can email me at ashley.arrington@ttu.edu. Thank you so much for your time. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to viewing your final assessments. Thank you so much. Have a great one. Bye-bye.